So I'm Persis Karim. I'm the director for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. And one of the important things that the center is trying to do is to support innovative new research and scholarship in both Iranian diaspora studies and related fields, ethnic studies, African-American studies, race and resistance studies. And it's my great privilege to share with you this first, what we hope will be an annual colloquium to share research by SFSU scholars. And today we have three people who are going to share their research with us and their various projects. And I'll introduce them sequentially. They'll each talk for 15 or 20 minutes. We'll have a little bit of time after each presentation for questions or comments. And then if we have time at the end, if people have any burning questions that don't get answered, I'm going to kind of monitor the time. So if you don't get your question in the sort of moments after each presentation, I hope you'll stick around. We're going to start with Kimia Akbari, who's where are you? I'm looking for you. Oh yeah, she's on my left side. Yeah, wave your hand, Kimia. And we'll spotlight the speaker while they're talking. And Kimia Akbari grew up in Tehran, Iran, before moving to the US in her adolescence. In her undergraduate years at UC Davis, she double majored in psychology and Middle East and South Asian studies. She's the founder and former editor-in-chief of the Other Collective, a print and online media platform covering issues, arts, and personal narratives of Swana communities. Kimia is a master's student in the College of Ethnic Studies, and she is the very first Azar Hatefi Fellow at the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. She's passionate about conducting research around the more recent wave of Iranian immigrants in order to complement and build on the amazing scholarship already done on the diaspora community. And she's interested in exploring the complexity and complications of the Iranian community and their immigrant experience. The title of her presentation today is Toward a Politics of Identity Over Identity Politics, Iranian American Organizing, Politicization, and Identity. And thank you, Kimia, take it away.
Thank you, Persis, and everyone who put this together. Yeah, very excited to be here and so touched to see so many familiar faces. I'm just gonna really quickly share my screen.
Hang on a second. Ariana, can you give her the spotlight? Or so she's not a tiny little box. There you go.
Let me just know. Is this okay? Do you also see the presenter view, or do you just see the?
We see the proper view here. You're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, yeah. So yeah, as Persis mentioned, the title of my talk is Toward the Politics of Identity Over Identity Politics, Iranian American Organizing and Politicization and Identity. And this is for my thesis project for the Ethnic Studies Master's Program. And to really begin with, I'm going to start with one of my favorite theoretical scholars, Antonio Gramsci. And this is just want to tell you like how I came to this topic that I'm studying. But basically, Gramsci is an Italian Marxist philosopher, and he kind of argues that there's no universal revolutionary strategy to challenge capitalism and hegemony, or we can think of it as like global forms of oppression. And the strategies that must develop really need to be unique to a particular historical moment and dynamic that is going on within that time in order for the most effective revolutionary strategy to be applied. And so my research, what it really aims to do is to be a generational investigation of how young Iranian Americans who are engaging in progressive, radical, or left-leaning politics are doing so in relation to their particular historical political context. And I use generational here Because if I think of, let's say, like 9/11 and the generation that was in their like early 20s or teenage years that was coming of age during 9/11, that event was a very like formative instance that was formative to their politics, to their lifetimes. Or let's say people like a decade or two before them in the 1980s who were Iranian American, the hostage crisis, the Cold War, the Iran-Iraq War. Those were very formative to their politics, to the narratives that they were being fed, that they were understanding in relation to themselves and the world around them. But the generational category that I'm looking at, who is between 25 to 29 years old at the moment, really came of age in their like late teens to early 20s within large-scale events such as the 2016 Black Lives Matter movements, the 2020 movement for Black Lives uprisings, the Muslim ban, and so on. So these are the more like formative like political events globally and nationally that really affected their understanding of politics and shaped their identities and efforts. So yeah, so that is just an overarching view. To tell you a little bit more about my methodology, I conducted 8 ethnographic interviews that were semi-structured. I had a set of questions, but it really went off of like the particular topics that came up within the participants. My sample size was 8 folks, which is small, but this research isn't meant to be a generalization of all Iranian Americans, but rather to really dig deeper into the particular experiences of these folks. And also it's a master's project, so there's only so much space to trace. And yeah, and my participant gathering really came from personal, social, or academic circles that I was involved in, and kind of a snowball effect from there. This table, as you'll see, is just like kind of like a demographic view of the folks that I interviewed that traces their age, their gender, their undergraduate degrees, which is particularly significant because one of my chapters really digs deeper into their studies and their like college experience. So that's why I added it as a category here. And also where they grew up in, like where they were coming of age. So I have one person from the South, like the South of the US, a few who grew up in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, and others who are in Northern and Southern California. So it's really interesting to like trace these patterns and make the connections within these like nuances of each particular area. And most of them were second generation folks, except for one who is technically considered 1.5 generation because they were born and raised in Iran and then moved here a little bit later on. And the way that I organize my thesis and my chapters is through my findings. So each of these chapters, racialization, radicalization, structural axis of power and oppression, double surveillance of political trauma, and solidarity is not a metaphor. These are the titles of my chapter that we will like dive into a little bit in the forthcoming slides. So the first chapter really focuses on the experiences of racialization based on micro and macro level social processes. And what that really means is here I'm applying the racial formation theory of Omi and Wanant. And so I'm looking at everyday experiences, but also legal, legislative, and kind of like policy-oriented events that shaped how they experienced racism or became racialized, but really didn't understand these experiences until they were kind of growing up and acquiring the language to make sense of, okay, like this is what was really going on. And that gradually, like that is what set the initial like light bulb and sparked their kind of like politicization based on their experiences. And I do kind of like dive deeper into like what sort of experiences they were. I wish I had more time to go into them, but one of them, for example, is one of the young participants who in middle school was part of a robotics team in Northern California and had this really incredible opportunity for her school to take that club, the robotics club, to visit NASA. But after learning that like she is Iranian, there had to be a whole series of like background checks and like processes that actually inhibited her from being able to go to NASA. And that really like affected the rest of her like time and like confusion of like, what is happening? Why is this happening? How can I like pursue my dreams and whatnot? And there's definitely a lot more like detail in the process, but that's just like one example of like later on understanding, okay, what was happening there actually. The second chapter, yes, the structural axes of power and oppression. Really what I dive into in this chapter is how the critical understanding of the interconnection of capitalism, of neoliberalism, of ongoing militarization and imperialism was personally transformative for these participants. So let's say if they were initially interested in partaking within like a nonprofit or an effort, how after they were able to make these connections, they then critique the institutions that they once looked up to. And I dig deeper into like what was happening in the university setting, which again is really key to that particular historical moment that I mentioned, with the narratives of politics going on, with the events going on, and how that really led them to this political transformation and being able to make these connections. So for example, what I mean by all of that is, let's say if like the uprisings were happening when they were in university, and then they were taking like ethnic studies courses, and then the ideas of like abolition were a lot more like popularly spoken of, or getting involved in Marxist communist organizing was no longer as taboo as it was for their like parents' generation. Those are all really formative things that were very personally transformative for them. So let's say if they were once volunteered for an international development org, or did like volunteering with refugees. And at first they thought, okay, well, I'm really making a difference. But then they actually got there and they saw, no, actually, the way that the refugees are experiencing this is a glorified prison. I'm not actually making a difference. What contributes to the displacement of people and refugee crisis is ongoing militarization, is ongoing war. And these things like that are informed by neoliberalism, they're just mitigating the impacts, but not actually making a difference, because the global axis of power is still ongoing. And in the next chapter, double surveillance and political trauma, I think it's very interesting how these things kind of play into effect with each other. But basically what I really dug deeper into this is how is like, particular experiences that are informed by, let's say, their family's ideas of the revolution, whether they were involved in the revolution, whether they were against it, whether they were for it, what happened in the aftermath, how are kind of their family's experiences passing down ideas of activism, of revolution, of organizing that kind of initially shapes their initial understanding of what it means to engage in these social movements. And then that being paired with, well, the surveillance that they face in the US through the war on terror, but then also the surveillance that they fear from the Iranian government by engaging in radical activism. How are these two things pairing together? And how are they kind of like reconciling them? Like, how are they shaping their views of the movements that they're involved in, the efforts that they're doing, the priorities that they must make in order to engage in the political beliefs that they have. And it's very interesting how it came up for everyone and how it was very formative in terms of the ideas. And the last chapter really focuses on solidarity. And this is a key point that really is formative in how they transcend identity politics, how they transcend nationalist views of activism, of organizing. So for example, yes, it is a key to be in community and in active solidarity with other marginalized communities, but more so what was really essential was transcending beyond being issue-based and issue-focused, and kind of acquiring this big picture understanding that I mentioned before in terms of the structural axes of power and oppression. And so let's say once, if their identities and their efforts were focused on, well, I'm Iranian, I'm Swana, I'm Muslim passing, or I am Muslim, that I must focus on these issues, but now it's a lot more of like a bigger picture. It's like an anti-capitalist identity rather. So in terms of the conclusions, I think with further globalization, with further destruction of the environments and the displacement of more communities, or maybe the immigration of more communities, this project is contributes to how we can kind of look at the way that identities are shifting and changing for multiple diasporas and multiple migrant communities that are being created. But then also really how young Iranian Americans in this time and place are organizing themselves, are making communities with others, and the basis with which they are making communities, and how they are applying a radical imagination for a different liberated future that they imagine, that is informed by all of the aforementioned experiences and factors that contributed to the way that they are operating and organizing themselves. And yeah, thank you so much. That's basically the end of my project. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask. And I can stop sharing my screen now.
Oh, Persis, you're on mute, I think.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Kimia. That was wonderful and really interesting. It's important to identify also that Kimia came with sort of interests in talking about race and racialization. And I think she really captured something that I think is so important, is to identify younger generation Iranian Americans who are quite different from, the folks who, as she pointed out, there's been some research on, who were mobilized during the civil rights era. So I wonder if people have any questions. If you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you. Let's see, Alex.
Hi, Kimia. Thank you so much for sharing your work. I feel like I learned a lot. A question I had, and this is something you mentioned in the first half of your presentation, was, I'm curious how you define identity politics. It's something that is used very often, especially throughout our master's program in ethnic studies, and how you've been investigating or perceiving the concept throughout your work.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Definitely. I think when I think of identity politics, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about being like issue-based. Like if the way that you are perceiving your values, or if the way that you are putting your energy into organizing is only like a single issue base, then that's kind of identity politics. Or if you are really thinking about things like in a nationalistic way, rather than maybe let's say, well, like I have all these critiques of like my own community, and I have all these critiques of like the outside like community that I am like displaced in, and kind of bringing that like critical lens to it, that I think that's how you kind of transcend identity politics, but really taking yourself out of community interest or like single issue based forms of organizing. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Fatima.
I think Katie had their hand before me.
Oh, okay.
Katie.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you, Kimia. It was so wonderful to see your research broken down. I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about the solidarity is not a metaphor piece, in terms of, I'm just thinking of, in some examples of like what issues young Iranian Americans are like taking a stand on, right? And like, yes, when I think of like the gamut of like sort of international anti-capitalist movements, and like whether this is them like being in solidarity on like Palestinian rights, or whether like just some more examples of what that means, because I think that, and I love that phrase, solidarity is not a metaphor, and like thinking about how we build stronger multiracial movements, I'm just curious, you can say a little more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when I kind of first, I guess, started the presentation with saying like how their own personal experiences and forms of racialization started to radicalize them when they kind of like grew up and were getting more involved in like Palestine solidarity or prison abolition, for example, then those were kind of things that took them outside of themselves and kind of actually like pushed a lot of them to be like, well, I think I've been Iran centric for a little bit too long. Like, I think like I feel kind of like limited if I'm only organizing against the Muslim ban, if I'm only organizing against sanctions, because the issue doesn't start and like end there. None of this happens in a vacuum. So they're all interconnected. So I think like I need to put my effort into like organizing with all these other communities who aren't necessarily like based on shared ethnicities or based on shared religions, because now I see that like how they are kind of, how these issues are interconnected, if that makes sense.
Okay, Fatima.
Thank you. Thank you, Kimia, for this really important work, specifically highlighting the role, I think, of the youth in such transformative visions. And I think what I appreciated most about your talk was the highlighting of the centering of race back to Iranians and Iranian Americans. I know when I started specifically my own work vis-a-vis, I think, racial profiling and racial justice around Middle Easterns in general, you know, when it came specifically to Iranian Americans, it was always kind of like, you know, whitening what it means to Iranian, you know, being Iranian American in a sense. So, you know, highlighting that, you know, Persian, not Iranian, for instance, and really disconnecting with any conversations and around race. So to see kind of like that shift specifically within, I think, you know, younger Iranian Americans, and here highlighting, you know, race and racialized understanding of their identities, it's really important. And I think speaks back to your comment around also building solidarities and understanding like more complex and nuanced ways of being and doing politics in this era. And my question has to do with kind of like intergenerational talk. I wonder, I know your focus is on the diaspora and mainly young Iranian Americans, but I wonder, you know, other, you know, generations, how do you, I don't know if you had talks with them, or how do you think they would respond to your own research and like this new understanding of like racialized Iranian Americans? And I'm assuming maybe the Muslim ban kind of like brought, you know, race into the conversation like more clearly to like American politics, but I wonder how other generations have, you know, within Iranian Americans have discussed this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Absolutely. I think actually, when I first kind of started thinking about my project, I was actually a lot more interested into like doing research on kind of this older generation of Iranians who maybe came here in like the 60s and 70s, and they were involved in a lot of like anti-imperialist, third worldist like coalitions. With other groups, let's say like in the Bay Area, they were heavily involved with like the Black Panthers. And I was like so interested in that because like you don't really know that growing up here until like you really like dig deeper and like look into it, that like, oh no, actually like this is my history and that's incredible. And I wish that like, yeah, and I wish like more people just knew that. So actually I started there, like I started thinking about the older generation and I did talk to them. I did like reach out to a couple of them. And yeah, and just kind of like hear like their experiences of like cross-racial organizing and whatnot. And I think one thing that's really interesting to me is that what I see now is really akin to what was happening then. And even though it might feel like there is this like gap between like the 70s and like now, and like this scale and this like, yeah, like the scale of like the solidarity organizing that's happening, like that was all still like going on. It just wasn't as like open and overt and like large scale as it is now and it was back then. But I really do think that's because of the particular like historical context, because of I don't know, like I think because of like the instances of state violence that happen, like make for this opportunity of like coalition building in a way that maybe like between then and now like didn't exist in the same way. But yeah, but I think it was super interesting to me, like to see how aligned the ideas of politics of identity, the ideas of anti-capitalism, and the ideas of solidarity building were so aligned with kind of these like older generation who were really radical and involved in organizing, and with these young folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Kimia. If you have questions at the end for Kimia or any of the other panelists, we'll give further time. I also wanted to just say one thing that's interesting about the work you're doing, Kimia, is also it suggestive of one important difference is that these are people who are familiar with and kind of institutionally familiar with the way things work in this country. So they have this opportunity that some of those earlier generations didn't, because they were essentially foreigners or weren't clear about where their place was in the US society. So I think it's really important work you're doing. So thank you. And we're going to move on to Leith Ghuloum, who's a graduate student and the Azar Hatefi Graduate Fellow for 2021, 2022. And they're doing work mapping the experience of queer Iranian diasporas in the Los Angeles area. Leith has worked on the Iranian Diaspora Archive that we have through the DIVA platform. And he also worked on the Del Badel podcast with the center. And the title for their presentation is Queer Iranian Diasporas Then and Now. Leith, thank you.
So hello, everyone. Today I'll be sharing a piece of my thesis research that is centered around the social and spatial politics of queer Iranian communities in Los Angeles. My project was largely an exploratory one, so I'll just be discussing a trend that emerged as I've been collecting oral histories that is likely not universal, but prominent enough among those I spoke to that I'm going to share. And so while discussions of queer Iranians in the United States are rather difficult to locate, it is quite common to see these discussions focus on those in Iran. Last year, a 20-year-old gay Iranian man was murdered by family members in Iran following the discovery of his sexuality. And the coverage of the death, which you can see here, there's two news sources. One's a NBC, and another one is an international Iranian gay and lesbian organization. The coverage of his death described his murder as an honor killing, which is a popular term used to describe the murder of LGBTQ plus individuals and women in Southwest Asia, North Africa, or SWANA region. This is a loaded term that's used in conjunction with typically Orientalist narratives of SWANA savagery that depict imperialist cultures as justified for their violence in the region by framing the war as based on bringing human rights to oppressed peoples. And you can see that the first story where they cite the second story here, they repeatedly say the original source described it as an honor killing, which is actually not to be found in the original source. That's something that they put in. And so the murder of these people are usually attributed as deaths by culture, which frames imperialist states as more progressive. And the coverage tends to ignore the fact that Iran has historically been a site of diverse representations of gender and sexuality, and that it was the introduction of European colonial powers that changed perception. They also tend to ignore that violence that queer individuals and women face in the diaspora are prominent in the United States as well. There are countless deaths in the United States alone that are usually framed as the result of rogue actors and that they don't reflect a cultural issue. And these narratives kind of only serve to amplify the growing rift between queer and SWANA diasporas. And while they emerge across the SWANA region, Iran in particular is often singled out for homophobia, and this is attributed to an acceptance of Islamophobic rhetoric that claims Islam is less amenable to homosexuality than Christianity or Judaism. That's usually perpetuated to support the war on terror. And in this context, the execution of queer Iranian youth is used as cultural currency to be stockpiled for current and future injustices against the Iranian state and its people. And this is not to say that homophobia and violence are not an issue in Iran that affects the queer Iranian diaspora. It is and it does, but I began my project kind of with this reflection just for the sake of background and to assert that homophobic persecution in Iran is not the only issue that queer Iranian diasporas have to deal with. And so my project largely you can go to the next slide. So my project largely focuses on hidden histories and communities, which are further obscured by factors like I just mentioned regarding narratives of Iranian homophobia. But there have been and continue to be queer Iranian organizations in the United States that do have histories. You can see two of the organizations, Human and Hasha, on the slide, historically provided resources to queer Iranians inside and outside of Iran through conferences, magazines, legal support, safe sex education in the Persian language. And both were most active in the 90s. Human fell apart as the millennium changed, and Hasha only lasted for 2 magazine issues. Human was based in Los Angeles, and Hasha was based out of San Francisco. And both these organizations occupied an important role as some of the only queer Iranian organizations to have existed. And after their dissolution, several organizations, few of which actually exist explicitly for queer Iranians, have moved to fill the gap. But despite these new organizations, and through my interviews and also supported by my own experience, those I spoke to are largely disconnected from Iranian queer communities, and not without a lack of trying. Several of those I spoke to discussed looking for that community in their youth, and although some found it later in life, it was less organic than I expected. Instead, many have found it through their professional exploits in academia and activism. However, they often found that despite some new connections, the community was lacking something that other queer communities of color do not typically, which is a history and a collective identity. One of them described the issue saying, like, there's just no information, there's just nothing available, when she tried looking for information about queer Iranian communities and support when she was younger. And this is not unique among those I spoke to. In their youth, none of those I spoke to actually connected to queer Iranian communities until they were older. And this was attributed to a dying out that queer Iranian organizations like Human and Hasha went through in the early 2000s, which were the formative years for most of those I spoke to. And several made a point to say that they have made connections through social media, but I would hazard that virtual connections are often not as strong, and many that I spoke to actually found them lacking in intimacy and substance. Some have tried to connect people through chat groups, but they found that they were fairly disconnected. And in my discussion with one of those I interviewed, James, he shared that he did not connect much with his Iranian identity as a youth. And this lack of community was attributed to how his queer identity put him in more danger than his Iranian identity as a young man, which may be one reason why the community feels so disconnected. And while I recognize that this may not be true for all queer Iranians, I do believe it is important to unpack how Iranian racial formations have changed in recent years compared to Iranians who grew up a generation before, who had to contend with explicitly Iran-America conflicts without the influence of the discourse that emerged following the September 11th, 2001 attacks. So several of those I spoke to mentioned that Iranians can be largely invisible in the United States, both culturally and physically, with many mentioning that they are often assumed to be Latinx, which was coincidentally also mentioned in the first issue of Hasha. And this is due to many factors, some of which I will discuss here. Like many in the Swana region, the immigration of Iranians has dropped significantly since 2001. A series of, you can go to the next slide. A series of legislation meant to target Swana diasporas has reduced immigration continuously over the years, including the Muslim ban, which that's the actual Muslim ban document there. And these factors have limited the number of new Iranians entering the United States. And those already here have experienced a great deal of assimilation. According to a survey, over twice the percentage of Iranian Americans hold bachelor degrees compared to the rest of the immigrant population. And this has increased to triple when looking at master's degrees. And Iranian Americans on average have a higher rate of speaking English at home compared to other immigrant groups. And so these factors, among some others that I'm leaving out for the sake of time, suggest that there has been a large motivation among Iranians to assimilate into American culture, and that they may also face less direct racism than other groups. And by direct, I mean specifically anti-Iranian. In my own family, there have been many stories about the need for assimilation. Very recently, my mother told me a story about how during the Iranian hostage crisis and in response to the rising price of oil, teachers at her high school would come to teach wearing t-shirts that just said, "I hate Iranians" on them. And in response, she ultimately went to a speech therapist because she came from Iran at a young age, a speech therapist to change her accent. And these experiences were not unique to my own family. Many shared that they heard stories from their parents that were more explicitly anti-Iranian. Some shared that in response to issues, Iranian families they knew would actively try to pass as other ethnicities. James too shared that his father did not speak Persian with him and his siblings because he did not want them to learn it. And the stories from those I spoke to who were all under 40 and grew up in the 90s and early 2000s were not, who were mostly grew up in the 90s and 2000s, were not focused necessarily on anti-Iranian racism. Rather, it was a type of racism propelled by the Gulf War and September 11th that grouped together Muslim Arabs and other Southwest Asians into an ambiguous racial category. Layla shared that in the 90s, she was called Saddam Hussein's daughter by peers and considered it just a conflation of being brown and indistinct from other brown people. And considering the ages of those I spoke to, it's not surprising that many of their experiences are centered around September 11th attacks. James shared that following the attacks, he and his siblings were made not to go into public spaces for a few months because there was a stabbing that was a reaction to the attacks. Farah shared a story about a teacher from New York that insisted on her being put in English as a second language course and was hostile to her presence in the classroom, despite her being well-behaved and fluent in English. And these experiences, while moments of racism, were not explicitly anti-Iranian. The experiences, when examined with the stories of those that I spoke to grew up hearing from their parents, show a different experience and may work to inform the racial consciousness of this generation of Iranian Americans, which I have observed to be largely focused on solidarity and actually defining Iranian identity. And what interested me was when put in comparison with those previous generation stories who were older teens or adults when the Gulf War began, the experiences were very different. For example, in Hasha's first issue, a story about the origin of Hasha, the relationship, there was a story about the relationship between two Iranians that's shared to give background of the magazine. And while the story is not, you can go to the next slide. Sorry for leaving this one on so long. Oh, one back. While the story is not explicitly focused on the Gulf War, it is shared that one of the two women was afraid that all Iranians were going to be interned in the same way that Japanese Americans were interned following the attack on Pearl Harbor. And among those I spoke to, none shared a fear this specific. Again, James stated that his queer identity put him in more immediate danger in his youth, which pushed him towards queer communities rather than Iranian communities. And I posit that this was due to a new era of invisibility for Iranian Americans, not only by virtue of increased assimilation, but also because of the new discourse of race, nation, religion, and gender that emerged following September 11th attacks. And so the language of this new discourse that emerged following the attacks skewed severely towards Arabs and Muslims, which has erased Iranian Americans in discussions around hate and exclusion. However, this has also allowed many Iranians with more ambiguous racial appearances to get by with without facing the same discrimination as other Swana diasporas, particularly the many non-Muslim members of Iranian diasporas in the United States. And this is not to say that Iranians have not faced discrimination in the United States in recent years. There have been some explicitly anti-Iranian hate crimes, and many Iranian Americans are Muslim and face hate crimes for visual indications of this religion, particularly women who choose to cover their hair. And there are also many Iranian Americans that have darker skin tones that make their identities as people of color more apparent. However, the discourse around these hate crimes makes it difficult to track those targeting Iranians. The majority of hate crimes target those perceived to be Arab or Muslim, according to Human Rights Watch. And this is not the extent of those being attacked. In addition to Iranians, other non-Arab Swana diasporas, including South Asian people, are also attacked for their perceived Arabness or Muslimness. However, all these identities are often excluded from reports on hate crimes. In a 2002 report from Human Rights Watch, they documented statistics for hate crimes against Arabs, Muslims, and those perceived to be Arab or Muslim. And according to that report, members of Swana diasporas are more likely to be victims of hate crimes if they occupy more stereotypical jobs, like taxi drivers or convenience store employees, as well as having identifiable religious garb or an accent. However, this is not always so clear for Iranians who are, again, rarely tracked, but also appear to have higher rates of assimilation and education compared to other immigrant groups. And this suggests that the discourse of hate has shifted away from Iran, and many of those who do experience hate now do so because of their perceived Arabness or Muslimness. This means that for those who are teenagers or young adults following 2001, they were typically not targeted for their Iranian identities in the same way that the previous generation was. There is still a great deal of racism, and Iranian Americans still have to contend with the massive surveillance structure that all Swana diasporas do, and violence and exploitation in the global arena. But here in the United States, it is a very different experience than those experienced by previous generations, who have largely moved to protect their children from the same type of racism that they experienced. And considering the political climate in the United States, where anti-LGBTQ+ rhetoric can be heard from politicians, comedians, and other public figures on a daily basis, it makes sense when James said that his queer identity put him in more immediate danger than his Iranian identity. And so just because I have to wrap up, this is just one of the trends that emerged from my research, and I do hope to continue developing it more over time. I take great inspiration from Latinx studies work because of the similar immigration stories between those communities and Swana diasporas. Exploitation, war, homophobia, sexism, and transphobia are very similar between the two communities. And I believe a lot can be gleaned from the theory that emerged from the suffering. And one of these theories is Hotaria Listening, which was described by Eddie Alvarez Jr. as a method that allows one to hear and access lost histories and feelings, accessing those effective moments critical to the reintegration of community and individual through the access and recovery of sonic trails. Basically, through Hotaria Listening, one can forge new trails to the past in order to reach radical futures of acceptance. And I too kind of thought of this as a project as a way to listen to the past and look forward to the future. And that's why it's really important, I think, to kind of like hear these stories and reflect on them, because without the work of speaking, listening, and learning, there will be nothing to listen to in the future. And that's all I have for you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leith. Really interesting, and also very interesting to follow Kimia's, because there's a lot of intersection between your work and her work. Let's see, I see a hand up. Iman, do you want to go ahead and ask a question? No? Okay, I have a question for you, Leith, because I noticed that you talked a lot about the positioning of Arab, Iranian, Swana folks, and I wonder if you have done any work with those who have come more recently under asylum status. not obviously in the last few years, but prior to the 2016 election, there was a significant number of Iranian queer folks who were able to come through asylum seeking status, or also were part of these underground networks through Turkey and Canada and some in the United States. And I just wonder if you have had any opportunity to speak with any folks who have that particular experience.
So the majority of those I spoke to were like 1.5 or second generation Iranian Americans. I did speak to someone who was in Iran as a youth, then moved to an area in Europe for a number of years before coming to the United States and settling in the Los Angeles area. And it was interesting because their experience was that they actually felt that the Los Angeles area was like a lot more accepting and diverse than the area they grew up from in Europe. And so like their experience of race and racism was they felt like less of an outsider in the United States than where they were before. And this project also looks at like a very specific age range of about 15 years. So it's kind of people who were in the United States from typically the 90s to like, and then the experiences through I guess the 2000s, which was kind of a very specific era. And I know that there has been a lot of there's been a lot more focus on Iran in the last few years, but I think that that's still very much developing, because I think the racial consciousness like was misdirected for well, not misdirected, but was directed specifically towards Arabs for so long, and I think that that's kind of changing now.
Great, thank you. And let me just say that we're also really proud of Leith because he's going to be entering a PhD program next fall at the University of Minnesota. And he's going to be focusing on gender and sexuality studies, I think, right, Leith?
Yes, yeah.
And so we can look forward to Leith continuing some of his work and perhaps deepening and broadening some of his subjects for this work. But I think it's really important also to have the like you said, Leith, the kind of hidden voices and hidden experiences. So I'm really, really pleased that you're going to be able to continue to do this work with the guidance of somebody like Dr. Sima Shahzari. So any questions for Leith before we move on? I want to make sure that if you have any in the immediacy of his talk, I don't see any hands. Okay. Oh, Katie, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say, Leith, thank you so much for this work. It's so important. And I'm just wondering if you mentioned sort of like some of the folks you talked to, this navigation of like trying to understand queerness within the context of Iranian history and not having a lot of education around that. And I'm just thinking of like Afsaneh Najmabadi's work around gender and sexuality and how like when first reading that, I was just blown away, like first grasping at like queerness as something that could be like rooted in our ancestry, right? And so like, I'm just wondering if amongst the queer folks you're talking to, like if there are strides towards educating our community more on like that history and like, sort of how folks are navigating that. I'm just super curious. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this work. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I think that I think that it should be acknowledged that like although there are some like new queer Iranian organizations, a lot of them that are based in the United States have been criticized as kind of not spotlighting, veering towards kind of like white hegemonic gay men type culture. And I don't necessarily think that those organizations are doing that work. And I think that that's kind of one of the largest issues. Like Afsana Najmabadi is like one of the only people in the country who has done that work. That kind of like taking a very historical lens to it. So I don't know. It's very tough. I don't know that many other people doing that work. I think she was one of like 2 to 3 faculty members in the entire country doing that kind of work, and she's now retired. So or is planning on retiring. So I think that that's kind of an avenue that definitely needs someone kind of paving the way for it now more than ever. Yeah.
Okay, Nazi, you had your hand up. Nazi? Oh. You're muted, Nazi.
Yeah, hi, Leith. Thank you. You can't hear me?
Now we can.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. Nazi, go ahead and speak.
Yes. It says my bandwidth is low, so can you hear me? Okay, great. Leith, thank you so much for the work that you've done. I just have a question. I'm curious about this because this could be maybe later research for you or for your colleagues who are paying attention to this field. Did you find that second generation Iranian LGBTQ plus members were better accepted by their families and had better familial support than the older LGBTQ plus members, because the older ones basically had none? And do you see that if the new generation of Iranians who's coming out is better accepted by their families, and that's one less worry for them in facing the issues in the society?
Well, I didn't necessarily speak to that many kind of older generation kind of queer Iranians in an official kind of like interview capacity. But from those I spoke to, like a lot of them did find a lot of acceptance. And there was kind of, I did leave part of this, this is actually in my thesis project, but I left it out from this presentation. There was this like feeling among many of those I spoke to that they wouldn't be accepted in their youth, which I don't think is necessarily unique to Iranians, but I think that there is this kind of cultural pervasiveness of these kind of homophobic narratives for kind of all Swana diasporas, that many kind of feared that experience. And one that I spoke to actually specifically avoided his family for a decade after he was very publicly outed, and avoided his family for a decade before kind of like reaching out and finding that like his family, even those in Iran, were just like, no, we love you. Like that's, that we don't have an issue with like who you are. So I think that there is this acceptance, but I think it is kind of clashing with kind of these dominant narratives where people kind of have to almost convince themselves that their family can be okay with it. Yeah, and I think that that's something that I definitely need to expand to, just because I don't know, it's a very complex topic, and I think I need to talk to a lot of people from kind of older generations who I have also found to be kind of more resistant to sharing their own stories. Yeah.
Oh, one observation that I've made, Leith, that might be worth thinking about in the future if you pursue this further is there's been a whole bunch of young adult queer Iranian novels written just in the last, like, I'd say 7-8 years. And I wonder if that too has contributed to both a feeling that they're not, that some of these younger queer Iranian Americans aren't alone, but also like giving some voice to that experience. And I think literature is a really interesting place to explore cultural shifts such as that one. So something I'm kind of interested in from the literature point of view. So thank you so much, Leith. Wonderful work, and we're excited to see what's next. Next and finally is Professor Fatima Zahrae Chrifi Alaoui, who received her PhD from the University of Denver. She's an assistant professor of rhetoric, social media, social movements, and social change. And she's the coordinator of graduate studies in the Department of Communication Studies at San Francisco State. Her research engages critical rhetoric, political communication, digital technologies, gender and sexuality studies, transnational feminism, and social change in a variety of contexts, including social movements, new media, political discourse, and pop culture. Her scholarship considers how the often non-normative, uninstitutionalized voices of resistance work to change their communities, and how normative or institutionalized discourse reinforce their ability to maintain power. Dr. Alaoui is the recipient of a grant that we offered almost 2 years ago in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movements. The center wanted to support research by faculty members who were engaging questions of race in their own work. And so Dr. Alaoui received this particular grant, and the title of her talk today is AI and Blackness, Moving Towards Debiasing AI Through Critical Ethical Communication Considerations. And she has a research assistant, so I'm going to let her introduce Elise today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful work. It's been so enlightening hearing your work, and I'm happy to also be sharing my work with you. So yeah, as Dr. Karim said, my talk today is around AI and Blackness, moving towards the bias in AI through critical ethical communication consideration. And this project was done in collaboration with Elise Jacobsen, who's a graduate student in the Communication Studies Department. She does work on political communication, race, and gender, with a specific focus on Iran. So just to give you a little bit of contextualization of this talk and what we'll be discussing, today we will be talking about AI, FDRTs, and Blackness. So the talk, the research is a little bit technical, but Elise and I try to simplify it as much as possible. So we'll give you a little bit of context as we're going through this. We will discuss how FDRTs are a threat to human rights. We'll contextualize the impact of these AI technologies through some case studies, and then we'll provide you with some recommendations on how to combat systematic racism and embrace opportunities for change. But first, I would like to provide an invitation and gratitude. First, gratitude for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies for supporting this project and amplifying the need for racial justice research. The students' participation in this research and the community connections that have been built from this project adhere to the social justice commitment of the center and the mission of SFSU to encourage faculty to engage with their individual fields of study as an extension of the classroom. And echoing Dr. Persis Karim's vision of the center, this project bridges disciplines while fostering social justice by studying ethnic, racial, and social justice issues in the arts, humanities, and social sciences to create opportunities for collaboration and exchange around the Iranian diaspora, both in and outside of the university. So this topic of this project, hopefully, the promise is to strengthen relations to Black, Indigenous, people of color, communities in San Francisco and beyond. This grant also allowed me to train a team of graduate students in communication research and advance the possibility of co-authoring with students with data analysis, namely, for instance, today, Elise will be presenting with me today. Also, Elise and I will be presenting this, this research research at the International Communication Conference at the end of May in Paris. So thank you so much for supporting our project, Perseus, and the team of the center. It's been such a pleasure working with you. And with that, let's start. So as I said, we'll try to do our best. Elise and I will be co-presenting. We'll do our best to simplify it. So when we unlock our phones with a glance and wonder how Facebook knew to tag us in that photo. Face recognition, the technology behind these features, is more than just a trick. It is employed for law enforcement surveillance, airport passenger screening, and employment and housing decisions. So despite widespread adoption, face recognition was recently banned for use by police and local agencies in several cities, including San Francisco. You might question why. So of the dominant biometrics in use, such as fingerprints, face recognition is the least accurate and is rife with privacy concerns. Police use face recognition to compare suspects' photos to mugshots and driver license images. It is estimated that almost half of American adults, over 117 million people, have photos within facial recognition network used by law enforcement. This participation occurs without consent or even awareness and is bolstered by a lack of legislative oversight. More disturbingly, however, the current implementation of these technologies involves significant racial bias, particularly against Black Americans. Even if accurate, face recognition empowers law enforcement systems with a long history of racist and anti-activist surveillance and can widen pre-existing inequalities. So for instance, in August 2020, the New York City Police Department used facial recognition technology to track down Derek Ingram, a protester who had taken to the street after the police murdered of George Floyd. After downloading images from Ingram's private social media accounts, NYUPD distributed his photos akin to a wanted poster and came to his doorsteps, demanding to arrest him without warrant. So though facial recognition software struggles to accurately detect Black and brown bodies and faces, these technologies are still used to survey marginalized communities without their consent. So before we unpack the talk, let's define some important technical terms so we're all on the same page. So Elise, I'll give you the first definition.
Hi, everyone. So what is AI? Artificial intelligence. Basically a wide-ranging branch of computer science that's concerned with building smart machines capable of performing tasks that typically humans would be able to perform. So examples of AI are Siri, Alexa, other smart assistants, self-driving cars, robo-advisors, conversational bots, email spam filters, and even Netflix's recommendations. And so specifically FDRTs, artificial intelligence has made it possible to recognize individual faces using biometric mapping. So this has led to advancements in surveillance technologies, and it compares to the knowledge of a database of known faces, which just seeks out to match. So basically, a system will have an entire database of faces and use one photo to try to connect the biometric data or the patterns to one face.
Thank you, Elise. Yes, and the features of AI, as Elise was saying, or artificial intelligence are many. So for instance, such as deep learning, which is, we live in San Francisco. So if you have ever seen a self-driving car, deep learning is the model that kind of like mimics human behavior. So, but here for today's talk, we'll focus on facial recognition as an AI technology. Facial recognition algorithms boast high classification accuracy, over 90%, but these outcomes are not universal. A growing body of research exposes divergent error rates across demographic groups, with the poorest accuracy consistently found in subjects who are female, Black, and 18 to 30 years old. So in the landmark study called the Gender Shades Project, an intersectional approach was applied to appraise 3 gender classification algorithms, including those developed by IBM and Microsoft. Subjects were grouped into 4 categories: dark-skinned females, dark-skinned males, lighter-skinned females, and lighter-skinned males. All 3 algorithms performed the worst on darker-skinned females, with error rates up to 34% higher than for lighter-skinned males, for instance, and as this graph shows. And independent assessments by the National Institute of Standards and Technology has confirmed that these studies finding that face recognition technologies across 189 algorithms are least accurate on women of color. So here you could see, for instance, some of these amplified inequities that come just from facial recognition. So the darker you are, the least accurate, your face will be recognized and matched. The lighter you are, the highest accuracy in a sense. So for this specific project, we have termed a term called Techno Blackness. So Techno Blackness is an analytical tool for unpacking the intersection for both technology and Blackness. And we see Blackness as a fluid, intersecting, and contested space that offers a multidimensional reading of Blackness in particular, and racial politics more generally. So specifically, most conversation remove Blackness or the idea of race from technology. And what Techno Blackness does is it centers the discussion around race and technology, that you cannot have a conversation about technology without discussing race. So similarly, for instance, when you think about queer theory, how it's highlighted the discussion of queerness around topics, or for instance, how Marxism highlights the conversations around class, Techno Blackness makes us, in a sense, reflect and not discuss anything without bringing this conversation around race. So over the past couple of years, specifically, the growing debates around automated facial recognition has reached a boiling point. As developers have continued to expand the scope of these kinds of technologies into an at most unbounded range of applications, an increasingly strident chorus of critical voices has sounded concerns about the injurious effects of the rise of such systems on impacted individuals and communities. Not only does the irresponsible design and use of facial detection and recognition technology threaten to violate civil liberties, infringing on basic human rights, and further impact the structural racism and systematic marginalization, but the gradual creep of face surveillance infrastructures into every domain of lived experience may eventually eradicate the modern democratic forms of life that have long provided cherished means to individual flourishing, social solidarity, and human self-creation. Defenders, by contrast, emphasize the gains in public safety. So conversations around AI and specifically facial recognition are very similar to conversations around the weaponization of, for instance, Homeland Security post 9/11. Like, for instance, we do need all this kind of like weapons, at the airport, or detection methods at the airport, because public safety is our #1 concern. Similarly, this is kind of like a conversation that has been adopted by, in a sense, the industry, tech companies, but also the public. So security and efficacy, that digitally streamlined capacities for facial identifications, identity verification, and trait characterization may bring. So these proponents point to the potential real-world benefits, like the added security of facial recognition, enhanced border control. So, and specifically, with the Trump administration, this started specifically with Obama and has been continued and reinforced with the Trump administration. The ICE border patrol have been using a lot of facial recognition systems to detain asylum seekers and stop them, and also jail them. So it has been used in a lot of, and again, we'll be talking more about how also it has been exported to other countries. And here we see kind of like the threat to democracy and democratic processes. So again, so the added security, recognition, enhanced border control, the increased efficacy of missing children or criminal suspect searches that are driven by the application of brute force, facial analysis to large-scale databases that may add convenience for facial verification in the business of everyday life. Whatever side of the debate on which one lands, it would appear that facial depiction and recognition technologies are here to stay. So whether one is unlocking iPhone with a glance, passing through an automated passport checkpoint at an airport, being algorithmically tagged in a photo on social media, being face scanned for professional suitability by emotion detection software at a job interview, or being checked against a watch list database for suspiciousness when entering a concert hall or sporting event, the widening presence of facial detection and analysis system is undeniable. Such technologies are, for better or worse, ever more shaping the practices and norms of our daily lives and becoming increasingly integrated part of the connected social world. Indeed, it is as a consequence of this easy to scam to the sneaking suspicion that coming the pervasiveness of facial analysis infrastructures is all but unavoidable. And again, I think here I would like to warn also about normalization of such technologies. And I know, for instance, when I have some of these conversations with my students, they're like, as long as I'm not doing anything wrong, why would I, for instance, be scared if my face or like my data is being used by governments or being used by the police and such things. So those are conversations in a sense that are happening, but here kind of like, the awareness or the danger of kind of like such technologies is not looked into. So this has led to a troubling absence in public discourse of the widespread engagement of fundamental moral questions, such as, should we be doing this in the first place? Are these technologies ethically permissible to pursue given the potential short and long-term consequences of their broad-scale development? Do technologists and innovators in this space stand on solid ethical ground and flooding society, whatever the cost, with these expanding capacities to globally automate unbounded personal identification and global smart surveillance? So those are some questions to think about, but also those are some of the questions that are guiding this project. And moving forward, we'll talk about some of the threats to fundamental human rights.
Yes, so Dr. Alaoui touched on the implicit acceptance of the use of facial recognition technology. If I'm not doing anything wrong, then why should I be worried? But the issue is that the bias inherently programmed into a lot of these algorithms means that people that don't do anything wrong sometimes do still get in trouble. So among other uses, AI algorithms are used in predictive policing to identify and sort through large amounts of historical data on criminal activity in order to determine people or places that are risky. So such processes are known as risk or threat assessment. And while generally well-intentioned, the historical data that feeds into these algorithms raises significant concerns because the data is subject to error. Law enforcers could incorrectly enter it into the system or overlook it, especially as criminal data is known to be partial and unreliable by nature, distorting the analysis. So the data may be incomplete and biased, with certain areas and criminal populations being overrepresented. It may also come from periods when police engaged in discriminatory practices against certain communities, so unnecessarily or incorrectly classifying certain areas as high risk due to bias. These implicit biases in historical data sets have enormous consequences for targeted communities today. And as a result, the use of AI in predictive policing can exacerbate biased analyses and has been associated with racial profiling. A good example are cases of Brescia Borden and Vernon Parter. Borden, an 18-year-old Black girl with no prior convictions, and Vernon Parter, a 41-year-old white man previously charged with armed robbery and sentenced to 5 years in prison, were both charged with various thefts of goods worth about $80 in 2014. Yet the AI algorithm Compass used by police departments to conduct risk assessments rated Borden as high risk of future conviction, while Mr. Parter was assigned as low risk. So the AI algorithm clearly discriminated against Ms. Borden because of the history of bias against people of color within the law enforcement system. And you can go to the next slide, Dr. Alaoui. So a case study that we outline in our research is a 2020 arrest of a Black man named Robert Williams. He was arrested for shoplifting almost $4,000 worth of watches from an upscale boutique. He was handcuffed in front of his family at his home and spent a night locked up. After questioning, however, it became very clear that he was nowhere near the scene of the crime. So why did they arrest him in the first place? A facial recognition algorithm had matched the photo of his driver's license to a grainy security camera footage. Now, there's an urgency in AI use to make really high stakes decisions. The stakes are higher because new systems can replicate historical biases at scale. When police officers are using these facial recognition technologies, they put a lot of trust in them. And big tech companies are profiting off of these abuses because they're the ones developing and selling facial recognition to government agencies. So it's our communities, and particularly communities of color, that face the harmful consequences. One of the fundamental questions of our work is, how do we build AI models that can deal with systemic inequality more effectively?
Thank you, Elise. So, and to understand how bias can crop up in face detection and analysis algorithm, it would be helpful to first understand a little bit about the history of how computers came to be able to detect, analyze, and recognize faces. This story really begins in the 90s when digital cameras started to commercially replaced older film-based methods of photography. So whereas traditional cameras produced photos using celluloid film coated with light-sensitive chemicals, digital cameras used photosensors to capture images by converting light waves into grids of pixel values that recorded the patterns of brightness and color generated by these incoming waves. So the ability to record images electronically as an array of numerical values was revolutionary. It meant that photographs became automatically computer readable and that they could be immediately stored and retrieved as data. So around the same time, the internet began rapidly to expand. And as more and more people started to use the web as a way to share and retrieve information, more and more digital images came to populate web pages, news sites, and social media platforms like MySpace, Facebook, Flickr. So not only did this increase in content sharing usher in the big data revolution, the growing online reservoir of digital images provided a basis for the development of the data-driven computer vision technologies that have evolved into today's FDRT. So here, I mean, if you read it, you see how kind of like how the recognition techniques, but we'll explain to you quickly how, you know, this becomes a problem. So the massive data sets of digital pictures that have fueled the training of many of today's facial detection and recognition models originate in this birth of the internet age. So how could face detection and analysis algorithms be biased? The story of bias in facial detection and analysis algorithm is a complicated one. It involves the convergence of complex and culturally really important legacies of historical racism and white male privilege in visual reproduction technologies, with the development of new sources of bias and discrimination arising from the novel socio-technical context of digital innovation and algorithmic design and production. That is, this story of algorithmic bias involves a carryover of certain discriminatory assumptions from the history of photography into computer vision technologies. It involves the appearance of new conditions of discrimination that have cropped up at every stage of evolution of facial technologies, from the way that human bias have crept into model design choices to the manner in which the massive data sets that feed data-driven machine learning have tended to overrepresent dominant groups and marginalized people of color. So the transition from analog film-based photography to digital pixel-based photography was not a clean break in terms of sociocultural assumptions that continue to shape the way people of different skin tones were presented in technologies of visual presentation and reproduction. From its first inception, sorry. Go ahead, Elise.
Hi, Dr. Alaoui. We just have a couple minutes left.
Okay.
If you wanted to skip to
Yes. So I mean, this is called the Shirley Card. The Shirley Card was used specifically by Kodak and Fuji as a way, in a sense, how color should look like. And so here we see, in a sense, every version of Caucasian or like lighter skin color, and with an absence, in a sense, of people of color. So, for instance, here, right in 2014, African American photographer emphasized this continuous of default of privilege and whiteness. Even today in a low light, the sensors search for something that is lightly colored or light skinned before the shutter is released. Focus is on a dark spot and the camera is inactive. It only knows how to calibrate itself against lightness to define the image. In 2009, Asian American blogger protested that the Nikon Coolpix smart camera she had bought for her mother kept registering that members of her family were blinking while the photos clearly showed that all their eyes were open. So here, we see kind of like the historical, what research has called, flesh tone imperialism translated into more kind of like recent facial recognition technologies with the racism. We have some recommendations in terms of like how to fight such system and how to make them more accurate. I'm not sure if we have time to do that. Perceives we don't. Okay, so we'll stop it here. We can give the recommendations during the Q&A. But yes, thank you so much. And I hope this at least brought awareness to some of like these important issues around facial recognition and racism. I'll stop sharing.
So thank you, both of you, for this really important work. It's obviously so relevant, and it's funny, just today I was talking to a couple of colleagues about an art project that a friend of mine did right in the aftermath of 9/11, when these wanted posters were appearing everywhere for 9/11 suspects or people who were implicated in what was clearly Islamic terrorism. And she did an art project because she looked at photos that appeared in the post office and photos that appeared on the FBI websites, and they were all men with black beards and women with hijabs, and they were so unclear, but you could see this was sort of pre-AI. You could see this idea that there was a kind of, not just a flesh tone, but a cultural kind of imposition. So it's really interesting to think about what the work you're doing now, if it had been available in period immediately after 9/11. So thank you. I want to make sure that if anyone has any questions or comments, we have a few minutes left. I'm sorry about not having more time. Neda has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I don't know, I just wanted to take this opportunity and thank all of the presenters for the intriguing and thought-provoking research that you've been working on. Kimia and Leith, and of course, Fatima, it's good to see you, Dr.
Good to see you.
And Elise, for all of the presentations. I wanted to take this opportunity also to thank Dr. Karim, Persis June, for your leadership, your vision, and for the kind of work that the center has been able to support. That's just amazing. I don't know, I'm short of words, but I'm very grateful for that. And to Katie and other professors who support the students that are the next generation of our scholars coming. Like Leith, you were talking about in Kimia Barafsan and Najmul, and you are the next generation. This is exactly what this is about. And a big congratulations to Donna as the new recipient of the fellowship. And at the very end, Persis, before we hang up, if there is any way to do a grid, Azar Hatefi is my mother, and she is 93 years old, and she lives in Sweden. I called her as we started the session to see if she wanted to just watch through my phone. And she said, I don't understand it anyways, but thank you for naming this fellowship after me. But I was just letting her know the kind of work that's being done in my way of honoring her. So I thought maybe we could send her a collective just hello on the screen, and I can record it and send it to her.
Would everybody like their faces be known so we can do that?
It would be awesome if everyone could be turn their videos on and just say hi to Azar.
I didn't want to say this at the beginning because Nada's very humble about, but this is really thanks to her generosity and her vision that these funds were made available. And I think she understands better than anybody that in order to do new research, you have to support it. So I'm exceedingly grateful. And I know everybody who benefited from it feels the same way, that you know, it's often not possible for people to fully grasp what is happening once they make their gifts or their generosity be known to a university. So I'm also grateful, not just for the generosity, but the interest that you have. And so thank you, Neda. It means a lot to all of us. Nader, you want to turn on your video? Malek?
Let's see if I can change.
We want to say a collective hello to Azar Hatefi. Ready? Here we go. Smile, everybody.
Salam.
Hi.
Hey, Mamnoon.
Salam, Azar Jun.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Just before we go, is there anybody else who wants to ask any questions of Fatima and Elise? And thank you again for this really important work. I don't see any hands raised. I think it's
Just really thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. I feel so energetic to see you're carrying the name of the center and the work. I'm grateful to you. And I hope that you guys are the beginning of many, many more to come.
Yeah. And Elise, especially thank you to you, because I do understand what it is to have a graduate student who's engaged with that kind of research alongside of you. And it's profoundly important to have a kind of mentor that Fatima is. So congratulations to you, and we look forward to engaging with you more, Elise.
Thank you so much. Yes, I really appreciate everyone's attention and also Dr. Alaoui's mentorship.
Okay. All right. Without further ado, we're going to close this out. And
There's some hands raised.
oh, sorry. Okay. I don't see any hands, but if you want to go ahead and I don't see any hands raised.
There's Kimia's hand, and then there's Nusha's
go
hand.
ahead. Oh, so Neosha and Kimia. Go ahead. Kimia, you go first, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Alaoui and Elise. What an incredible project. I think as you were like presenting and talking about this, and especially bringing up the fact that like your students thought like, well, they're not in danger like from the surveillance systems because they're not doing anything wrong. I guess I'm kind of wondering like if in your research you kind of also spoke of how with like the increasing use of like visual social media like TikTok and Snapchat and, you know, like filters that like are also kind of like facial recognition. I guess the impact of that, or like the maybe like the direction in which that's headed toward. And I guess I don't know if like you brought that up to your students, or what did you kind of like respond to them? And yeah, I'm just kind of like interested in that. It's really fascinating.
Thank you, Kimia. Elise, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, and if you have anything else to add, you can say after. But we definitely surveyed the facial filters and kind of the normalization of surveillance that Facebook tagging and Instagram and Snapchat filters creates. And additionally, the kind of pretty obvious white supremacy present in a lot of these facial filters that specifically tend to mute non-white racial features. And so that was definitely a big part of our literature review, as well as just, yeah, the normalization of surveillance and the kind of association with privacy that people now have, where we just are pretty willing to give a lot of our data away. And sometimes we're not aware of how valuable that data may be.
Yeah, and just to add to Elise, I think when we surveyed students specifically, people are mostly concerned with interpersonal surveillance. So for instance, like, you know, an ex or a stalker, like someone they can actually identify, then, you know, I would be worried. However, for instance, if it's business surveillance, so for instance, you know, giving your number to targets or like signing up for emails and like, or being identified, you know, or like, for instance, with Apple, you know, having, you know, in a sense, the facial recognition or unlocking your phone, people are okay with that. And with the government, when we ask them specifically with the government, all their answers, as long as I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm okay with the government having my facial data. So unless, for instance, there are people who are activists or they are actually involved within, for instance, contemporary social movement, they would say, for instance, that they are scared or they feel at risk or that they are endangered. However, most people that we survey, their only concern is interpersonal surveillance. So an ex having their picture or like their data. Yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Neosha?
Hi, thank you for the great presentations. My question is kind of from the center. I'm a graduate student based in New York, and my work relates to all three of the presentations. And I was wondering if the center only supports works that are done within this San Francisco State University, or focused on Iranian diaspora. For example, if it's like my thesis, MA thesis is on Afro-Iranian performance, but it's not about diaspora, but it is also about like a diaspora in Iran. So I was wondering, how can I receive support from the center if I'm not a student in San Francisco?
Well, I think you should email me separately,
Sure.
just because that's kind of I'd rather talk to you in more detail about your work, but we are encouraging people, for example, to submit their work to a conference that we're hosting next year in February at UCLA. You can probably see the announcement on our Facebook and Instagram, and also if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, and I will work as much as I can to give you some feedback on your project, but I think it's probably something that involves a longer conversation.
Sure, thank you. I'll email you.
Thank you for coming. We really appreciate having students from other institutions as well. Okay, is there any other questions before we close it out? Nope. Okay, well, I want to say a big thank you to all four presenters. We got the highlights, but they have been in the trenches working on this for at least the last year, and in some cases for much longer. And I think it's really exciting to see your work kind of gelling, and we look forward to seeing more. And I'm especially grateful to our 2 graduate students because they also participated in some of the projects at the center, and many of those projects are also coming to fruition and couldn't have been possible without their time and energy. So thank you, Kimia and Leith, and congratulations to you both on your soon-to-be complete theses. And I thank all the audience members as well for staying with us, and I wish we had more time, but we have to wrap it up. So thank you very much. And we do have a recording, so Netta, you'll be able to share it with your mom, hopefully. And I think that's Elise's father who's in the room as well. Thank you for being so patient to get to your daughter's talk. And we love that parents showed up for their children as well. Okay, have a wonderful day, and thank you again. And thank you, Netta, for your support.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.